$50. That was the number on the screen before the world fell apart. You might think $50 is pocket change, barely enough for a decent steak dinner these days. But in the frantic, sweat-soaked pits of the commodities exchange in 1980, $50 an ounce for silver was the financial equivalent of a nuclear detonation. In less than a year, the price had exploded by over 700%, a vertical line on a chart that looked less like a market trend and more like a middle finger to reality. And then in a blink, it was gone. Imagine waking up to find that the solid ground beneath your feet has turned into quicksand, and the rope you were holding onto, the one labeled safe investment, is actually a noose. That is precisely what happened on Silver Thursday. We aren't talking about a bad day at the office here. We are talking about a catastrophe so immense it threatened to vaporize the entire U.S. financial system. Think about the sheer insanity of it. One day, you are the king of the world, sitting on a mountain of metal worth billions, effectively holding the global economy hostage. The next day, you're staring down the barrel of a $1.7 billion margin call. That is billion with a B. It is the kind of debt that doesn't just bankrupt a person, it bankrupts nations. It dissolves dynasties. It makes grown men in three-piece suits weep in public bathrooms. And the kicker, this wasn't an accident. This wasn't some invisible hand of the free market gently correcting itself like a polite butler tidying up a messy room. No, this was a crime scene. A rigged game where the rules were rewritten in the middle of the match because the wrong people were winning. You see, silver isn't just shiny metal used for grandma's tea set or the insides of your iPhone. It is the most manipulated, kicked around, and abused asset in human history. It is the red-headed stepchild of the precious metals family, always living in the shadow of its golden brother, yet somehow always at the center of the dirtiest bar fights. But before we get to the billionaires crying poverty and the regulators rewriting the rulebook to save their own skins, you need to understand the smell of the room. Picture the commodities floor in New York. It's not a sterile office with ergonomic chairs. It's a gladiator pit. It smells like stale coffee, cheap cologne, and fear. Men are screaming, waving their arms like drowning victims, buying and selling futures contracts that represent more silver than actually exists above ground. It is a casino where the house doesn't just have an edge. The house owns the dice, the table, and the security guards. And into this shark tank swam a couple of whales from Texas who thought they were big enough to swallow the ocean. They didn't realize that when you try to eat the ocean, sometimes the ocean decides to drown you instead. This is the story of how greed blinded the smartest guys in the room, how the system panicked when it got beat at its own game, and how, at the end of the day, the little guy, you, is always the one left holding the bag while the titans get a slap on the wrist and a bailout. Welcome to the Great Silver Rig. Now, let's meet the architects of this beautiful disaster. If you are picturing slick, Gordon Gekko types with gelled hair and Italian suits, costing more than your car, wipe that image out of your head immediately. We are heading down to Texas, the land of big hats and even bigger egos, to meet Nelson Bunker Hunt and his brother William Herbert. These guys looked less like financial masterminds and more like two accountants who got lost on the way to a buffet. Bunker, the ringleader, was a heavyset spectacle with thick plastic glasses who allegedly didn't like flying first class because he thought it was a waste of money. Yet, he was sitting on an oil fortune so vast it would make a pharaoh blush. Their daddy was H.L. Hunt, a man who allegedly won his first oil well in a poker game, so you could say gambling was in their DNA. But unlike their old man, who just wanted to pump black gold out of the ground, the brothers had a different obsession. They were terrified. See, in the 1970s, the world felt like it was coming unglued. Inflation was eating the dollar alive, tearing through savings accounts like a swarm of locusts. The government was printing money as if they had an endless supply of green ink and zero understanding of basic economics. Sound familiar? To the Hunts, The US dollar was nothing more than a glorified IOU from a broke uncle. They were what we call hard money fanatics. They believed that paper currency was destined to become toilet paper, and the only things that mattered were things you could touch, hold, and drop on your foot: land, cattle, oil, and, most importantly, silver. They didn't just like silver. They worshipped it. They saw it as the poor man's gold, a finite resource that the industrial world desperately needed, but was treating like trash. They looked at the price, sitting around a miserable few bucks an ounce, and they didn't see a bargain. They saw a cosmic injustice. They saw a market that was asleep at the wheel, and they decided it was time to wake it up with a sledgehammer. But here is where it gets spicy. A couple of cowboys from Texas, no matter how rich, can't take on the entire world alone. They needed backup. So they went shopping for partners. And they didn't go to the local country club. They went to the Middle East. They courted Saudi sheikhs, men with petrodollars spilling out of their pockets, pitching them on the idea that the West was crumbling, and silver was the ark that would save their wealth from the coming flood. Imagine that dinner table conversation. Texas drawls mixing with Arabic, united by a mutual distrust of the U.S. Federal Reserve and a shared lust for cornering a market. They formed a secret alliance, a cabal of unimaginable wealth, labeled I-Miki, focused on buying silver, and not just buying it to flip it for a quick buck. No, they were playing for keeps. They weren't speculators. They were accumulators. They wanted to own it all. They looked at the Wall Street banks selling paper contracts, promises to deliver silver they didn't actually have, and they smiled. They knew the banks were bluffing, and the Hunts were about to call that bluff with a pile of chips so high it would block out the sun. Most people on Wall Street treat commodities like fantasy football. They trade contracts for corn they will never eat, oil they will never burn, and gold they will never touch. It is all just a digital ledger, a game of musical chairs played with paper promises. But the Hunt brothers? They weren't playing a paper game. They were playing for the actual chairs. They didn't just buy futures contracts. They stood for delivery. In the polite, civilized world of the commodities exchange, this is considered incredibly rude. You're supposed to sell before the contract expires, take your cash profit, and go buy a yacht. You're not actually supposed to ask for the truckload of silver to be dumped on your driveway. But the Hunts didn't want cash. They hated cash. They wanted the metal. They started acting like a giant industrial vacuum cleaner, sucking every available ounce of physical silver out of the market and locking it away where the sun didn't shine. This is where the story turns into a spy thriller. We are talking about logistics that would make a military general sweat. The Hunts weren't just storing this stuff in a local safe deposit box. They were paranoid that the U.S. government would confiscate their silver, just like Roosevelt snatched everyone's gold back in the 30s. So they decided to move it. They chartered Boeing 707 jets, private airliners, solely to transport bullion. Picture this: huge planes landing in the dead of night, guarded by private armies of security men armed to the teeth, loading crate after crate of silver bars. They were flying this treasure hoard out of the reach of Uncle Sam and straight into the vaults of Switzerland. It was a mass exodus of wealth, a financial airlift of biblical proportions. They were draining the CumEx vaults in New York and Chicago dry, leaving nothing behind but dust and panic. The effect on the market was like tightening a noose around a neck. Usually there is a natural ebb and flow. Silver moves in, silver moves out. But the Hunts were a black hole. Everything went in and nothing came out. The supply literally began to vanish. Manufacturers who actually needed silver to make things, film for Kodak, electronics, silverware companies, started to freak out. They would call their suppliers and hear a dial tone. The physical float, the amount of silver actually available to trade, was disappearing into the Swiss Alps. The Hunts and their Saudi friends had effectively cornered the market, not by being smarter traders, but by being brute force hoarders. They created an artificial scarcity so severe that the price had no choice but to go vertical. They were forcing the market to choke on its own lack of inventory, and they were watching with glee as the desperation started to rise. By the time the calendar flipped to 1980, the silver market wasn't just hot, it was radioactive. We are talking about a vertical launch that defied gravity, logic, and the prayers of every banker in New York. The price of silver, which had been lazing around $6 an ounce just a year prior, tore through 10, smashed through 20, and kept rocketing upward until it kissed $50. For the average person, this meant digging through the attic to find Aunt Edna's sterling silverware to pawn for a quick payout. But for the Wall Street establishment, this was the apocalypse. You see, the big bullion banks and brokerage houses weren't betting on silver to go up. They were short. Let me explain shorting in a way that captures the sheer stupidity of their position. Imagine selling your neighbor's car to a stranger for $5,000, promising to deliver it next week, because you are absolutely convinced you can buy it back from your neighbor tomorrow for $3,000. You pocket the difference. That's the profit. It's free money, right up until the moment your neighbor decides he loves that car and won't sell it for less than $50,000. Now you don't have a profit. You have a catastrophe. You have to buy that car at the insane new price, or you go to jail. That is exactly what the banks had done with silver. They had sold millions of ounces of silver they didn't own, assuming the price would stay low, and the Hunt brothers would eventually get bored and go home. They were wrong. The Hunts weren't selling. They were buying. And because they were demanding physical delivery, there was no silver left for the banks to buy to cover their own bets. This is what we call a short squeeze, and it is the financial equivalent of being slowly crushed in a trash compactor. The big boys, firms like Makata Metals, and others with deep ties to the exchange, were bleeding out. Every time the price ticked up $1, they lost millions. The floor of the COMEX wasn't just loud, it was the sound of sheer terror. Grown men were screaming into telephones, watching their firm's capital evaporate in real time. They were staring at a black hole that was sucking the solvency right out of their balance sheets. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. These were the masters of the universe, the sophisticated geniuses who looked down on the Hunts as dumb cowboys playing with daddy's money. And yet, here they were, trapped in a corner by those very same cowboys. The banks were on the hook for billions of dollars they didn't have, desperate for metal that didn't exist. They were begging, pleading, and sweating through their expensive suits. But the market has no mercy. The price kept climbing, relentless and cruel. The Hunts had their boot on the neck of the establishment, and for a brief, shining moment, it looked like the cowboys were going to win. But if there is one rule you should never forget, it is this. When the casino starts losing, they don't just keep dealing the cards, they change the rules. You know that feeling when you are playing a board game with a toddler, and the moment they start losing, they flip the board over and scream that the rules are stupid? Well, imagine that toddler is the board of directors of the COMEX, and instead of a tantrum, they have the legal authority to destroy your life. By January 1980, the powers that be on Wall Street were staring into the abyss. The shorts, the banks, the establishment were facing total annihilation. If the price of silver kept rising, the checks they would have to write would bounce higher than a rubber ball. The system was insolvent. In a fair market, they would have gone bust. They would have packed up their desks in cardboard boxes and wept on the subway. But this, my friends, was not a fair market. This was their club, their building, and their ball. And they decided that if they couldn't win the game, they would simply change the rules in the middle of the fourth quarter. Enter Silver Rule 7. It sounds like something out of a bad sci-fi movie, but it was the weapon that killed the bull market. The exchange officials, many of whom had personal financial interests in seeing the price drop, huddled together in a panic-stricken emergency meeting and dropped the nuclear option. They declared liquidation only. Now, let me translate that from financial gibberish into plain English. It meant that from that moment on you could only sell existing positions. You were forbidden, banned, blocked, denied from buying any new silver futures. Think about the insanity of that for a second. A market requires buyers and sellers to function. They literally made it illegal to buy. Imagine walking into a grocery store and being told, "Sorry, you can't buy apples today. You can only return the ones you already bought." What happens to the price of something when nobody is allowed to buy it? It crashes. It has to crash. It's like gravity. By removing the buyers from the equation, the COMEX artificially engineered a collapse. It wasn't a correction. It wasn't market forces. It was a hit job. They tied the Hunt brothers' hands behind their backs, blindfolded them, and then told the banks to start swinging baseball bats. The price didn't just drift down. It was pushed off a cliff. The Hunts, who were leveraged to the eyeballs, suddenly found their mountain of wealth turning into a landslide. They couldn't buy more to support the price. They could only watch in horror as the value of their collateral plummeted, triggering the very thing they feared most: the margin call. The establishment had circled the wagons, protected their own, and decided that fair play was a luxury they couldn't afford. The house always wins, even if they have to burn the casino down to do it. It all came crashing down on March 27, 1980, a date etched in financial infamy as Silver Thursday. If the previous weeks were a slow-motion car crash, this was the moment the gas tank exploded. The phone rang at the Hunt brothers' headquarters, and on the other end wasn't a friendly business partner. It was their broker, Bash Halsey Stewart Shields, sounding like a man with a gun to his head. They demanded $100 million. Immediately. Not tomorrow, not after lunch. Right now. The Hunts, who were technically billionaires on paper, checked their pockets and found nothing but lint. They were illiquid, a fancy financial term for rich in stuff, poor in cash. They told the broker they couldn't pay. And in that moment, the broker stopped being their employee and started being their executioner. Panic is a contagious disease, and on that Thursday, it infected the entire world. The brokers, terrified that the Hunts' insolvency would drag them into bankruptcy, began a fire sale of epic proportions. They seized the Hunts' bullion, the very silver that had been squeezed from the market, and dumped it back onto the floor like garbage. They didn't care about the price. They just wanted out. The market floor turned into a riot. Traders were shoving, screaming, and weeping as the price of silver plummeted from over $21 to under $11 in a matter of hours. It was a 50% haircut in a single session. Imagine owning a house worth $500,000 at breakfast and finding out it's worth $250,000 by lunch. That was the scale of the destruction. But here is the real kicker, the part that should make your blood boil. As the Hunts were being gutted, the shockwaves threatened to shatter the big banks that had lent them money. If the Hunts defaulted, the banks would collapse, and if the banks collapsed, the economy would flatline. So, who stepped in? The Federal Reserve. The grand protectors of the free market orchestrated a massive bailout. But let's be crystal clear. They didn't do it to save the Texas Cowboys. They did it to save the Wall Street establishment. A $1.1 billion line of credit was arranged to allow the Hunts to pay off their debts to the banks. The Hunts were forced to mortgage everything, their oil, their cattle, their bowling alleys, their dignity, just to make the banks whole. The message was loud and clear. If you are a speculator, you get crushed. But if you are a bank that lends reckless amounts of money to a speculator, here is a check from Uncle Sam. The Hunts were left picking through the rubble of their empire, tied up in lawsuits for decades, while the system that rigged the game against them dusted itself off and went back to business as usual. You might be sitting there thinking, wow, what a crazy story from the ancient times of 1980. Thank goodness we have computers, regulators, and transparency now. Surely this kind of Wild West banditry couldn't happen in our sophisticated modern age. Oh, you sweet summer child. If you think the game got cleaner, I have a bridge in Brooklyn to sell you. and I'll finance it with subprime loans. The players changed, sure. The Texas Cowboys, with their drawls and questionable fashion choices, were replaced by PhDs in physics and algorithms that trade in nanoseconds. But the game remains exactly the same. The only difference is that now the rigging is automated. Fast forward to the 2010s. Enter the precious metals desk at J.P. Morgan. These weren't outsiders trying to corner the market. These were the insiders running it. For years, their traders were engaging in a practice called spoofing. It sounds like a harmless prank, but it is actually financial fraud. Here is how it works. They would place massive orders to buy or sell gold and silver, creating the illusion of huge demand or panic selling. The market, reacting like a herd of frightened sheep, would move in the direction they wanted. Then, milliseconds before the orders could be executed, they would cancel them. Poof. Gone. It was a mirage. They were phantom orders designed to manipulate the price so they could make a killing on their real positions. They were painting the tape, lying to the world, and robbing day traders blind, day after day, year after year. And did they get away with it? Well, yes and no. Eventually, the Department of Justice woke up from its nap and slapped J.P. Morgan with a $920 million fine in 2020. It was the largest fine of its kind in history. Sounds like justice, right? Wrong. To a bank that generates trillions in flow and billions in profit, a $900 million fine is not a punishment. It is a parking ticket. It is the cost of doing business. It is a fee you pay to the landlord for the privilege of looting the tenants. The individual traders got into some trouble, sure, but the machine kept humming. The silver market remains one of the most opaque, concentrated, and confusing casinos on Earth. So, what is the lesson here? What do we take away from the hunts, the crash, and the banksters? It is simple. The market is not a fair arbiter of value. It is a battleground. When you step into the ring with silver, you aren't just betting on a metal. You're betting against the most powerful financial institutions in human history. The hunts tried to break the bank, and the bank broke them. The modern banks rigged the game, and they just paid a toll to keep playing. If there is one thing you must understand, it is that in the world of high finance, the house doesn't just have the edge. The house builds the table, deals the cards, and owns the guy who serves the drinks. If you want to play, go ahead. But don't you dare act surprised when the dealer pulls an ace out of his sleeve.